I can still feel the weight of that moment, hanging in the air like a breath I forgot to release. The dinner party itself was ordinary enough, the Hendersons' annual gathering. The same guests I'd greeted year after year, settled around the mahogany table like well-worn pieces of a puzzle I thought I knew by heart. The candles flickered against wine glasses half empty, casting shadows that danced across cream-colored walls. Someone was talking about school board elections. Someone else mentioned the new restaurant downtown. The kind of conversations that fill space without saying anything at all. I sat in my usual spot, the one that had somehow become mine over years of these gatherings. My husband Miles was across from me, animated as he told a story about something that happened at work. I watched his hands move as he spoke. Those same hands that had held mine during our wedding ceremony 15 years ago. Hazel, our daughter, giggled at something the Martin Langford boy whispered to her from the far end of the table. The sound of her laughter should have warmed me. Instead, it felt distant, as if I were hearing it through glass. Sloane sat beside me. She had arrived late, as she always did, slipping into the chair next to mine with that effortless grace she'd possessed even as a child. Her presence changed the temperature of the room in ways I couldn't name. She wore a simple black dress, nothing remarkable, but on her it became something else entirely. The fabric moved with her breathing, and I found myself noticing things I shouldn't have been noticing. We had been friends since childhood, Sloane and I. She was the one who had convinced me to sneak out of my parents' house when we were 16. She was the one who had held my hair back when I was sick from too much wine at graduation. She was the one who had disappeared into the world while I had stayed, building this life of dinner parties and school pickup lines and grocery lists. That never seemed to end. Now she was back, sitting so close I could smell her perfume. Something with jasmine that reminded me of nights when we were young and thought we could become anything we wanted. Her return to town 3 months ago had been unexpected. A phone call out of nowhere saying she'd taken a job at the local gallery. I had been surprised by how much I wanted to see her again. The conversation continued around us, a gentle hum of voices and clinking silverware. Mrs. Martin Langford was describing her grandchildren's piano recital. Mr. Chin was explaining something about his garden. Normal people living normal lives, and there I was among them, playing my part perfectly. The devoted wife, the attentive mother, the woman who had never once stepped outside the lines drawn for her. That's when Sloane leaned closer. Her movement was subtle, the kind of shift anyone might make to hear better in a crowded room. But when she turned toward me, her lips nearly brushed my ear. The sensation sent something electric down my spine, and I had to grip my wine glass tighter to keep my hands steady. Her voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for me. She told me she wasn't wearing anything under that dress. The words themselves were simple, but they landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread through every part of me. I thought I had learned to ignore. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dinner party continued exactly as it had moments before. Miles still gesturing with his fork, Hazel still giggling, the Martin Langfords still being gracious hosts. But everything had shifted. Time seemed to slow and speed up simultaneously. The sound of laughter became muffled as if I were suddenly underwater. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and knew I was blushing. Sloane straightened in her chair, returning to her wine as if nothing had happened. But I caught the slight smile at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes stayed fixed on her plate just a moment too long. She knew exactly what she had done. 23 years of friendship, and she had never said anything like that to me. 23 years of carefully maintained boundaries, and she had just crossed every single one with 6 simple words. I tried to take a sip of wine, but my hand was trembling. I set the glass down quickly, hoping no one had noticed. The weight of her confession settled over me like a heavy blanket. Not just the words themselves, but what they implied, what they invited, what they acknowledged about the tension that had been building between us since her return. All those long phone calls, All those coffee meetings that stretched into lunch, then into evening. All those moments when our hands had brushed while reaching for the same thing, and neither of us had pulled away quite fast enough. I looked round the table at these people I had known for years. These neighbors and friends who thought they knew me completely. If they could see inside my head right now, if they could feel what I was feeling, would they recognize me at all? Or would I become a stranger? Someone they had never really known despite all the birthday parties and book clubs and casual conversations over backyard fences? Miles caught my eye from across the table and smiled. It was the same smile he'd given me 1,000 times before, full of easy affection and comfortable familiarity. I smiled back automatically, the response so practiced it required no thought. But inside, something was fracturing. Something was coming undone. Sloane's presence beside me felt enormous now, impossible to ignore. Every small movement she made seemed amplified. The way she reached for her water glass, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she breathed. I was hyper-aware of the space between us, the few inches that suddenly felt both too much and not enough. The truth was settling into my bones with a weight I couldn't shake. I wanted her, had always wanted her, maybe in ways I had never let myself acknowledge. And now with those 6 whispered words, she had opened a door I wasn't sure I would ever be able to close again. The dinner party went on. People laughed and talked and shared dessert. I participated just enough to avoid questions, but inside I was somewhere else entirely. Inside, I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a life I had never imagined for myself, but suddenly couldn't stop thinking about. When we finally said our goodbyes and walked to our cars, Sloane caught my hand for just a moment. Her fingers were warm against mine, and she squeezed gently before letting go. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew everything had changed. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my wedding ring catching the light from passing street lamps. Beside me, Miles talked about work deadlines and weekend plans, his voice a familiar soundtrack to the life I had built. But all I could think about was Sloane's whispered confession, and the way it had shattered something inside me that I hadn't even known was fragile. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to me. But I already knew the careful boundaries of my life. The neat categories I had used to define myself were crumbling, and for the first time in years, I felt terrifyingly impossibly alive. The next morning arrived exactly as every morning had for the past 15 years. My alarm buzzed at 6:30, pulling me from dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling hollow. Miles was already in the shower, the sound of running water mixing with the coffee maker's gentle burbling downstairs. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling that needed repainting, trying to shake off the strange weight that had settled over me since the dinner party. Our bedroom was decorated in shades of beige and cream, colors I had chosen because they were safe, timeless, appropriate. The wedding photo on Miles's nightstand showed us 20 years younger, both of us grinning at the camera with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you know exactly how your life will unfold. I had been 26 then, my hair longer, my smile unguarded. Looking at that photo now felt like looking at a stranger. I pulled myself out of bed and began the routine that had governed my mornings for so long. I could perform it without conscious thought. Shower, coffee, wake Hazel for school, pack her lunch while she stumbled around upstairs, always running 5 minutes late despite my attempts to establish earlier bedtimes. Make Miles's coffee the way he liked it. To sugars, splash of cream, check the weather, check my phone, check the calendar on the refrigerator that detailed every appointment and obligation in neat color-coded boxes. The house itself was a testament to the life I had built. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen island where we gathered for hurried breakfasts before scattering to our separate days. The living room had a sectional sofa we had picked out together, positioned perfectly to face the television, where Miles spent most of his evenings. In the corner sat the treadmill we had bought with such good intentions 3 years ago, now serving mainly as an expensive clothing rack. Everything was in its place. Everything matched. Everything spoke of a woman who had her life together, who made sensible choices, who prioritized her family's comfort above all else. But as I moved through these familiar rooms that morning, I felt like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life. I used to paint. The realization hit me suddenly as I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out coffee mugs before loading them into the dishwasher. I used to paint and I used to be good at it. In college, I had spent entire nights in the art studio, my hands stained with oils and acrylics, my hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow always came undone. I had rented a tiny loft after graduation, barely big enough for an easel and a futon, with north-facing windows that filled the space with perfect light. I had been fearless then. I painted abstracts that made no sense to anyone but me, swirling compositions of color and emotion that poured out of me like prayers. I submitted my work to galleries and didn't care when they rejected it. I waited tables at night to pay rent and considered myself the luckiest person alive, because I got to spend my days creating something that mattered. When had I stopped? The answer came to me in fragments. Meeting Miles at a friend's birthday party. His steady presence such a contrast to the chaos of my artistic world. The gradual shift from spending entire weekends painting to making time for dinners and movies, and long walks through parks. The practical conversations about careers and futures and the kind of life we wanted to build together. Marriage had seemed like the natural next step, and I had been happy, genuinely happy. Miles was kind and reliable and loved me in ways that felt safe and permanent. When Hazel came along 2 years later, the transformation was complete. The loft became impossible to maintain with a baby. The art supplies got packed away, supposedly temporarily, in boxes that eventually made their way to the basement. I told myself I would get back to it someday when Hazel was older, when we had more space, when life settled down. But life never settled down. It just changed shape, morphing from one set of demands to another until the woman who used to paint, until Dawn became someone who scheduled oil changes and attended parent-teacher conferences and knew exactly which grocery store had the best prices on organic produce. Sloane had been there through all of it, at least in the beginning. She was my maid of honor, beautiful in a blue dress that somehow managed to look both elegant and slightly rebellious. She held Hazel at the hospital just hours after she was born, tears streaming down her face as she whispered something to my daughter that I couldn't hear, but that made my chest tight with emotion. But Sloane had never been the type to stay in one place for long. Even as children, she had been restless, always planning her next adventure. While I was content to spend summers reading in my backyard, she was convincing her parents to let her go to camp in another state, or to spend weeks with relatives I had never heard of, who lived in places that sounded impossibly exotic. After college, as I eased into life with Miles, Sloane was off teaching English in Thailand. Then she was pruning grapes in France. After that, Portland, then Denver, and a handful of stops I couldn't keep straight. We stayed connected through occasional emails, sunset photos from far-off places, sketches of people who seemed to live by rules I'd never learned. Her updates read like a glossy travel feature. Mine read like a home improvement brochure. Both had their virtues, I told myself. Both were legitimate ways to spend a life. But seeing her again, after so many years watching her move with the same effortless assurance she'd had at 17, made me painfully aware of how narrow my world had become. 3 months ago she called to say she was coming back. The downtown gallery needed a new curator, and she was tired of drifting, ready to land for a while. I was startled by how thrilled I felt at the thought of her being close again. I'd forgotten what it meant to have someone around who remembered the person I used to be. Her place was everything mine wasn't. She'd rented the top floor of an old Victorian near downtown, high ceilings, hardwood that creaked in all the right ways. Macrame plant hangers framed the windows. Books were stacked on every surface, many in languages I couldn't read. The walls were layered with pieces she'd gathered on the road, works that pulsed with color and stories I wanted to hear. The first time I visited, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Envy. Not for her things, exactly, but for the way she inhabited space. Nothing in her apartment sounded like compromise or committee. Every object felt chosen, placed with intention. The whole place read as an extension of who she was, not a careful arrangement designed to keep everyone comfortable and no one offended. We slipped back into friendship as if the years were only a long pause. She made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten I could. She asked questions that cut deeper than calendars and chore charts. When I spoke, she listened, truly listened, as if my thoughts deserved her full attention. Yet, even before the dinner party, there were moments I caught a look on her face I couldn't interpret, something like sadness or longing, as if she could still see a version of me I had misplaced. Those looks unsettled me in ways I wasn't ready to examine. Now, standing in my meticulously arranged kitchen with morning light pouring through curtains, chosen to flatter the paint, I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. Did she see the woman content with safe choices and a careful life? Or the ghost of the girl who believed she could paint her way towards something that mattered? The question trailed me through my usual routine. It lingered when I dropped Hazel at school. It followed me to the grocery store, then back to an empty house that felt enormous and suffocating at once. I found myself in the basement, staring at boxes of art supplies I hadn't opened in over a decade, wondering if the paints had crusted over, if the brushes had stiffened, if any trace remained of the woman who once made something from nothing. Upstairs, the house waited for me to fill it with the comfortable busyness that typically carries me through the day. But all I could hear was Sloane's whisper from the night before, and the way it had split something inside me I wasn't sure I could close again. The call came 3 days later while I stood in the kitchen, staring at a grocery list that felt monumental in its ordinariness. Milk, bread, chicken for dinner, the mundane arithmetic of keeping a home running. When Sloane's name lit my phone, something fluttered in my chest that I pretended was simple pleasure at hearing from a friend. Her voice was warm and a little breathless, as if she'd rushed to call. There was an opening at the gallery that weekend, a group show of local artists. Nothing formal, she said, just wine, conversation, and people who still believed art could change the world. She wanted me to come see what she'd been building, remember what it felt like to stand before beauty and let it wash over me without measuring purpose or practical use. I hesitated, scrolling through the usual reasons I couldn't. Hazel had a soccer game Saturday morning. I'd promised to help at the church bake sale. The house needed cleaning, and Miles and I had vowed to finally tackle the garage. Ordinary life tugging with 1,000 small, reasonable obligations that somehow turned crushing in the aggregate. But even as I lined up excuses, I knew I wanted to go. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by predictable comfort, I felt a hunger I hadn't named in years, not just for art, but for the self who cared about art, for conversations deeper than carpools and meal plans, for the chance to feel something that didn't need to be categorized or controlled. That evening, when I mentioned the invitation, Miles surprised me. We were tidying up after dinner, moving through the choreography we'd perfected over years. He loaded the dishwasher while I wiped the counters. When I told him about the opening, he paused, then encouraged me to go. "You should," he said without looking up. It had been too long since I'd done something just for myself. He'd handle Hazel's game, take care of the rest. His generosity should have warmed me, but something cold settled in my stomach. The ease with which he released me from my usual duties felt less like kindness and more like relief, as if he, too, was weary of the delicate balance we'd built. Saturday evening, I stood before my closet, paralyzed by choices that suddenly felt heavy with meaning. What do you wear to remember who you were? I chose a simple black dress, not the risk I might have taken 20 years ago, but polished enough to feel like an effort. In the mirror, I looked exactly what I was, a suburban mother trying to be something else for a few hours. The gallery sat in a converted warehouse, industrial yet intimate. Music and laughter drifted through the open doors as I approached, and for a moment I almost turned back. It had been so long since I'd walked into a room of strangers, so long since I'd tried to be anyone besides Miles's wife or Hazel's mother. Then I saw Sloane through the window, animated, gesturing as she spoke to a small group. Something in her posture pulled me back to the girl who once convinced me to crawl out a bedroom window to watch shooting stars from her garage roof. The same charge, the same energy that made everything around her feel brighter and more possible. She spotted me the second I stepped inside, her face lighting with genuine joy. As if my presence were a gift, she slipped from her circle and crossed the room, taking both my hands, natural and yet edged with something I couldn't name. The space was everything my house wasn't. Exposed brick, canvases that seemed to breathe, sculptures claimed corners and alcoves, refusing tidy explanations. The air smelled like wine and possibility, the scent of people who still believed in the transformative force of beauty. Something dormant in me stirred. Proud, Sloane guided me through the room, introducing me to artists and collectors whose names I used to recognize from culture pages I'd stopped reading. She called me an old friend who understood art beyond prices and reviews. The way she framed me made me feel like someone worth hearing, someone whose opinion mattered. We paused before a series of abstract works that echoed my college pieces, swirls of blue and green that seemed to move even when I stood still. The painter, a woman about my age, had returned to the studio after her children left home. She talked about reclaiming parts of herself she'd believed were gone, about daring to prioritize something that served no one but herself. As she spoke, Sloane's nearness registered as warmth. She stood close enough for our shoulders to brush when she leaned in to show a detail, close enough that the Jasmine I'd noticed at the dinner party found me again. In a low voice, she recalled other openings we'd haunted in college nights. We'd stayed until closing and then carried our debates to diners that poured coffee until dawn. The evening blurred into wine, conversation, and that particular alchemy that happens when strangers bonded by art share the most intimate truths of their creative lives. I heard myself talk about painting in ways I hadn't in years, not just technique, but the urgency that once drove me to make. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt seen as more than a supporting player in other people's stories. As the room thinned, Sloane suggested air. The night was warm and clear, the city lights soft against the dark. We walked toward my car, neither eager to end the night. The silence felt different now, weighted by everything that had passed between us, and everything unsaid. At the car, she leaned against the passenger door, quietly blocking my exit. Not that I wanted to leave. Under a street lamp, she looked uncannily like the girl I'd loved in college, though I'd never given it that name. The same dark hair falling across her brow, the same to knowing eyes, the same smile that made me feel singular. She told me how good it was to see me like this, lit from within, away from the constraints of suburbia. They should have been compliments, but they landed like gentle indictments, underscoring the distance between who I was and who I might have been had I chosen differently. When she lifted a strand of hair from my face, her fingers lingered longer than friendship permits. Electricity raced through me, waking nerve endings I'd forgotten. For a suspended moment, we just looked at each other, the air dense with possibility and risk. I should have stepped back, made a joke, gotten in the car, and driven home to my safe life. Instead, I leaned into her touch, eyes closing as her thumb traced my cheekbone. When I opened them, her expression made my knees soft and my pulse pound in ways that had nothing to do with friendship. A laughing group passed by, breaking the spell. She dropped her hand and stepped away. but the space between us still hummed with the unsaid. I fumbled for keys, muttered about getting home Hazel's early game. Normal words that felt hollow. Now, she wished me a safe drive, her eyes never leaving mine, mirroring the same longing and confusion tearing me apart. The drive was a tunnel of lights and signs and hands so unsteady I gripped the wheel hard. In the driveway, my heart hammered so loud I thought the neighbors might hear. I sat in the dark car, breathing, before going inside. The house was quiet. Miles slept on the couch, glasses askew, a book splayed across his chest. I switched off the TV and covered him with the throw gestures I'd made 1,000 times. Tonight they felt like lines in a play I wasn't sure I wanted to perform anymore. In our room I undressed slowly, catching my reflection and changed on the surface. While something tectonic had shifted underneath, the gallery had woken a part of me. Sloane's touch had set it ablaze. I didn't know how to make it quiet again. In bed, listening to Miles's steady breathing, I tried to understand. The woman in the gallery, alive with ideas and possibility, felt like someone I'd forgotten existed. The woman who nearly melted under Sloane's hand felt like someone I'd never allowed myself to be. Both were me. Both were true. I didn't know how to fit them into the person who would wake up to breakfast and soccer practice, and the life I'd so carefully assembled. I only knew something fundamental had shifted, and there was no unknowing it. The shift came slowly, the way spring arrives in quiet installments. You don't notice it until the world is green again. Sloane began dropping by more often, always with a perfectly reasonable pretext. She brought coffee from the downtown place, the dark, bitter roast I drank in college. She arrived with books under her arm, novels by writers I'd never heard of, art volumes crammed with images that reminded me why I once believed beauty could tilt the world. She insisted I read them, said she couldn't sleep until she knew my thoughts on this poem, that photograph. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt guilty realizing how easily I had let my curiosity dull. When had I stopped seeking new ideas, new angles, new ways of seeing? When had I settled for the familiar loop of grocery aisles, school events, and shows that asked nothing of me but passive attention? Our conversations stretched beyond casual. Afternoon coffee became early evening wine, then bled into phone calls that ran past midnight. Sloane had always been easy to talk to, but now there was a different charge and intimacy beyond nostalgia. She asked the questions no one had asked in years, not about logistics or anyone else's needs, but about my dreams and fears, the parts of me I'd shelved when life asked me to be more manageable. When I told her I missed painting so much, it hurt. She didn't offer soothing lines about someday. She asked which colors I dreamed in, whether my hands still remembered the pull of a brush heavy with paint. Something dormant woke up. I laughed, the kind of laugh that leaves your stomach sore. After she left, mirrors showed flushed cheeks and eyes brighter than they'd been in years. I looked like someone thoroughly engaged, thoroughly alive. But it went deeper than that. Her attention reminded me how it feels to be seen as a whole person, not a stack of roles. When she looked at me, I wasn't just Miles's wife or Hazel's mother. I was Iris, the woman with opinions about art and politics and books. The woman who once painted until dawn and called it time well spent. Miles noticed, though he couldn't name it. He caught me humming over laundry or staring through windows with a faraway look he didn't recognize. When he asked what I was thinking, I learned to deflect. The truth was, I thought about Sloane constantly, her laugh, the way she talked with her hands, the look she gave me when she thought I wasn't watching. The first deliberate touch happened on my couch as we discussed a novel about a woman who left her marriage to photograph Morocco. Late afternoon, the house empty, Hazel at a friend's, Miles at work. Sloane placed her hand on my knee to make a point. It lasted seconds, but heat rippled through me. Even after she pulled away, I could feel the imprint of her fingers. We didn't mention it, but the air shifted, tuned to a higher frequency. After that, touches multiplied. Her hand on my shoulder as she passed behind my chair. fingers grazing mine as she handed me a glass. The warm press of her arm when she leaned in to show me a page. Each one could be written off as accidental, and yet each felt entirely intentional. I craved them in ways that scared me. Hazel started calling her Aunt Sloane, a title that seemed to attach itself without any discussion. My daughter has always been at ease with adults, but with Sloane, something different bloomed. Maybe it was how Sloane spoke to her like a person, asking real opinions and treating the answers with respect. One night I overheard Hazel telling her best friend how Aunt Sloane had taught her to braid bracelets using a trick learned in Guatemala. The ease with which Sloane wove herself into our days should have felt natural. Instead, it made me wary. What would people think if they knew how often she was here? What would Miles think if he realized how central she'd become to our routine? I began living into worlds I couldn't reconcile. There was the world of mornings and practices and dinner talk about homework and weekends, where I performed capably, asked the right questions, and kept the balance smooth. Then there was the world Sloane opened where I felt fully awake, where conversations mattered, where every exchange hinted at discovering something new about myself. In that world, my thoughts carried weight. The contrast grew so stark it felt like a double life. I'd spend an afternoon with Sloane, feel more myself than I had in years, then go home and struggle to care about the details that used to consume me. When Miles asked about my day, I trimmed the truth into something small and harmless. Coffee with a friend. The long drives started innocently. Sloane suggested we continue conversations somewhere private. We drove to the lake or the overlook at Miller's Ridge, places where words could stretch. We always ended the same way, sitting in my car as night fell, talking into a silence, humming with everything unspoken. The air felt so charged I half expected it to spark. We stared ahead through the windshield as if the dark might hold answers we dared not voice. Sometimes she turned, and I felt her gaze like a hand on my skin. When I looked back, the tenderness and want in her eyes made my breath catch, too much like love to pretend. We were just old friends, and still, we didn't cross the line. We didn't say the words. We hovered on the blade between friendship and something more dangerous. The tension became unbearable. I lay awake beside Miles, my body buzzing. I replayed every conversation and touch, trying to understand what Sloane wanted and what I was willing to give. I started seeing my marriage clearly, how we'd settled into parallel lanes that met mainly round tasks. Our talk had become functional schedules, logistics not dreams. We moved like considerate roommates, efficient, kind, sparkless. Miles wasn't unkind. We had stability many would envy, but stability had cost us surprise. Sloane reminded me what it feels like to be desired, to be pursued instead of presumed. When she looked at me, I felt interesting, beautiful, worthy in ways that had nothing to do with how well I kept the world running. The realization that I was falling in love arrived by degrees. Then all at once, it wasn't only physical, though that current was undeniable. It was the way she made me feel like myself, a person with desires and ideas that mattered. The way she listened as if my words were worth keeping. She saw potential I'd forgotten. Love brought terror, too. Love meant admitting everything I'd built might not be enough. It meant facing the price of safety. I stood at a cliff's edge, behind me the known and careful, ahead the uncertain and alive. I knew I couldn't balance between both much longer. The storm hit without warning on a Tuesday in early October. The kind of downpour that turns streets to streams and sends everyone running. I was loading the dishwasher when fat drops smacked the glass. Minutes later, rain hammered the roof so loudly conversation was useless. Miles retreated to his study, reports due in the morning. Hazel rehearsed a presentation upstairs, her voice floating down. The house felt wrapped in routine. When the doorbell rang, I expected a neighbor or a drenched delivery. I did not expect Sloane, soaked despite the short doubt from her car, hair plastered to her head. White blouse turned sheer enough to make me avert my eyes and pull her inside. She shivered, whether from cold or something else. I couldn't tell. I fetched towels, one over her shoulders while she apologized for the puddle forming at her feet. She said the storm caught her driving home from work and somehow she'd ended up on my street, pulled by a feeling she couldn't explain. I made tea, grateful for a task while I tried to read the bright, crackling energy she brought with her. It wasn't only the weather. When our fingers brushed as I passed the mug, the familiar jolt shot through me. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we ate breakfast, where Hazel did homework, where mail got sorted, with Sloane across from me, hair curling as it dried. The room felt charged, foreign. The storm raged, wind and rain drumming a kind of isolation. Lightning flashed. Thunder rattled the cabinet doors. In the strobing light, her face flickered shadow and brightness to beautiful and serious for comfort. We started with small talk, weather, an upcoming show, the book she'd given me that I'd read twice and hadn't dared discuss. The conversation was choreography, both of us circling the thing between us. As the night deepened and the storm refused to move on, our words turned direct. She asked whether I was happy, whether this life filled me, whether I ever wondered about the road not taken. Instead of intrusion, her questions felt like a door propped open. I said things I'd never voiced. Old dreams about art. How sometimes I felt like I was sleepwalking. How I worried this might be all there is. The words poured out like a breached dam. She listened without flinching, her eyes fixed on mine. When I ran out, the kitchen went quiet, only the storm and the soft clock ticking. Then she spoke steady, quiet. She told me she'd thought about me constantly since coming back. That seeing me woke feelings she'd buried. That watching me navigate this careful life made her ache with a longing she couldn't name away. She'd tried to keep distance, to respect lines, but the pull was stronger than her good intentions. She was tired of pretending. Her words hung like smoke, visible, undeniable. My heart pounded. Everything I'd shoved down was suddenly right there between us. She said we both knew why she was here. Something in me clicked into place, the lock turning. I wanted to say something to end the spell, or seal it, but no words came. The silence stretched dense with fear and possibility. She reached across the table. Her hand trembled as it crossed the space to mine. When our fingers touched, it felt like stepping off a ledge. Electricity raced through me, waking every sleeping wire. I should have pulled back, cited the hour, my marriage, my daughter asleep upstairs. Instead, I turned my hand and threaded our fingers. The intimacy of it startled me, more honest than any kiss I'd shared with Miles in years. We sat like that while the storm roared, hands joined, no words afraid to shrink the moment with language. For the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own body, clear about what I wanted. The revelation wasn't simply that I loved Sloane, though the truth struck like lightning. It was that this had always been there beneath layers of expectation and compromise. This woman who could tremble at another woman's touch, whose world could race shape around connection, who could sit in her own kitchen and know she'd been only partially honest with herself. Footsteps on the stairs. We separated our hands slowly, reluctantly. By the time Miles stepped into the doorway, we looked like two friends riding out weather with tea. But something had shifted beyond recall. As he made polite talk and offered to drive her when the rain let up, I felt distant, performing a role while some essential part of me flew beyond reach. The storm, like all storms, passed. Sloane left with a promise to text when she got home, her eyes lingering on mine a beat too long. I washed cups, checked locks, turned off lights, closing down the house as always. But climbing the stairs, I knew nothing was the same. I had touched the truth of myself. Now I had to decide what to do with it. The days after blurred with ordinary moments that felt anything but. I moved through routines like an actress who'd misplaced her lines. Every surface held a memory. The table where we held hands, the door where she stood dripping, the window where lightning revealed things I couldn't unsee. She didn't call. I was grateful for the space even as I ached for her voice. I knew she was giving me room to think. Still, the quiet felt like a test. I scrolled our old texts for meanings I'd missed. The words read differently now, heavy, with subtext. 3 days after the storm, Miles found me at dawn in the kitchen, the same table, the same chair. I'd been awake for hours, staring at Sloane's name, trying to either call or delete. The phone lay between my hands like evidence. He came in softly, robe knotted, hair mussed. He stopped when he saw me yesterday's clothes, early light. That posture that said this wasn't about sleep. He made coffee without speaking. The sound of our morning routine filled the space while we both braced for the conversation we couldn't avoid. When he sat down, his eyes flicked to the phone. Sloane's name glowed on the screen. The silence carried 15 years of shared life and the weight of what was about to change. Miles has always read me well. He knew this wasn't a rough week. It was structural. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, the tone you use with a skittish animal. Was I okay? Was there something I needed to tell him? Kindness hurt worse than anger. I couldn't meet his eyes. I stared at my hands around the mug and noticed my ring finger bare. I'd taken the ring off while washing dishes and hadn't put it back. The pale band of skin looked exposed. He saw it too, and I watched understanding settle on his face, not shock. Exactly. More like a resignation that made me think he'd been waiting for this. He asked the question I feared. Was she the reason I wasn't here anymore? Not physically, but in the ways that matter? I could have lied, blamed restlessness or stress. But in that pale light, looking at the man who loved me for 2 decades, I couldn't. The words tumbled out. I didn't know how to stop what had started. I couldn't unknow what I knew about myself. Something had woken that felt truer than anything I'd felt in years. I watched him hold himself steady, but pain flickered underneath. When I fell quiet, the silence felt apocalyptic. This kitchen site of breakfasts and birthday plans and mortgage arguments had become the place our marriage would begin to come apart. The ordinariness made it surreal. His response was softer than I expected. No rage, no demands. He asked if I loved her. The question cut through everything else. Was this love, or something transient I could outlast? I wanted to make it easier to say it was confusion that would pass. But he deserved the truth. Yes, I said. I loved her. I had been falling for months. He absorbed it with the same quiet dignity that had always been his strength. He didn't fall apart or ask for details. He asked what I wanted to do. What came next? That's when I broke. Loyalty to a good man. Responsibility to our daughter. The life we'd built. And then the other truth. Who I was becoming in Sloane's presence. The choice was impossible: safety and sense on one side, a love that made me feel alive on the other. He let me cry, patient as if he'd seen this coming. When I calmed, he reached for my hand, the first tender touch in longer than I could remember. He said he'd noticed me changing, becoming someone he didn't recognize, but who looked happier. He loved me enough to want that happiness, even if it didn't include him. His generosity made me feel small and selfish. It also made clear we couldn't stall forever. Hazel deserved honesty. Our families deserved more than a staged performance of fine. We ended without a plan. Some decisions can't be rushed, but they can't be dodged either. He showered and left for work, moving through his routine like a man insisting on normal in the face of chaos. I stayed at the table, staring at my phone. I could call Sloane and say I couldn't do this, the price too high. I could recommit to my marriage and try to be satisfied with a life chosen before I knew my options. Or I could call and say I was ready to step into the unknown. The phone waited, silent. For the first time, I understood the choice was mine alone. No one could tell me what I owed or what price was worth paying. The question was whether I had the courage to choose the life that called to me. The decision arrived not with a thunderclap, but in that thin, breath held hour just before dawn. Miles had left his ring on the counter the night before, placed deliberately beside the spot where mine should go. No speech, just two rings telling the truth. I picked up mine from the nightstand and turned it in my palm, remembering the woman who wore it for 15 years, good, steady, loving in all the ways she knew, but only half alive, afraid to open certain doors. In the gray kitchen light, I set my ring beside his. The small click sounded like a book closing. The room looked unchanged. I was not. I walked the house bare feet on familiar floors. In the living room, photos lined the walls. Birthdays, holidays, vacations, true smiles captured in their time. Now artifacts of a life I was expanding beyond. I wasn't erasing her. I was acknowledging she wasn't who I needed to be anymore. Hazel slept, face smooth with childhood. Guilt tightened in my chest, braided with resolve. I wanted her to see what choosing truth looks like even when it's hard. She would have questions I couldn't fully answer, but she would also have a mother who lived honestly. The house felt different, less like a container, more like a chapter ending well. I dressed simply in clothes that felt like me. The mirror showed a woman I recognized, not younger, but present. Sun rose as I drove to Sloan's. Streets I knew looked newly drawn in early light. My hands were steady now. I parked across from her building as the sky warmed. I sat for a moment, engine off, looking up at windows that might hold the woman I loved. Anticipation and fear pressed hard in my chest. I didn't call. No warning, no script. This moment needed to be honest. The sun lit the brick of forgiving gold. People began their day with the assurance of those who know where they belong. I felt for them envy and pity in equal measure. My bare ring finger on the wheel caught my eye, pale and unburdened. I realized coming here wasn't even about Sloan. It was about me, about the woman I am when I stopped trying to be the woman everyone else needs. Whether she opened the door or had already moved on, I had chosen bravery. I breathed deeply, fully, as if the world finally offered enough air. Whatever happened, knocking or driving away, welcome or refusal, something had already shifted. For the first time in years, I sat inside the whole truth of what I wanted, not the sanitized version, but the messy, human one. The choice to step out of the car hovered suspended between wanting and having. But being here at all felt like victory. I had stepped into myself at last. Whatever comes next can arrive in its own time. The essential thing is that I am finally, fully here.